So welcome to this Dharma discussion and practice for the Samatha Vipassana Trust, where we follow the teaching, the TWIM teaching of Bhante Vimalaramsi. And before we start, we're just going to recall, if you like, the qualities of the Buddha. And these are an important reflection on all that the Buddha achieved as a result of his own efforts. So it's called the Namo Tassa, and in English it's honor to the Blessed One, the Exalted One, the fully self-awakened or self-enlightened one. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Honor to the Blessed One, the Exalted One, the fully self-enlightened one. And today, we're going to look at a sutta from the Sutta Nipatta, a very famous collection of relatively short suttas. And this one is in the Book of the Eights. It's actually chapter 4, not chapter 8. It's chapter 4, called the Book of the Eights, and it's sutta number 11. And it's called the Kalahaviva Sutta, the Kalahaviva Sutta, disputes and contentions, with the subtitle, the causes of anger and attachment. Now, I particularly like this sutta because of its relevance to our experience in daily life. So not only is it relevant in the context of our practice, but it translates right across all areas of our life. Sir, said the questioner, whenever there are arguments and quarrels, there are tears and anguish, arrogance and pride, and grudges and insults to go with them. Can you explain how these things come about? Where do they all come from? The tears and anguish that follow arguments and quarrels, said the Buddha, the arrogance and pride, and the grudges and insults that go with them are all the result of one thing. They come from having preferences, from holding things precious and dear. Insults are born out of arguments, and grudges are inseparable from quarrels. So here, the Buddha's identifying this process of having preferences as the root cause of disputes and contention. So what does it mean to have preferences? Well, preferences, as described in the teaching of Bhante Vimalaramsi, come about when we start to take our experience personally. At what stage do we take things personally? Well, this is where the exploration around dependent origination is really important for us. Because dependent origination tells us and shows us and invites us to experience for ourselves the whole line of events as they occur through our experience. And so one of the things that we've actually got going on there is that because we're human, we have a mind and a body. And with that mind and body come the 6 senses. So we have the 5 outward-facing senses: the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, and the tactile feeling of the body. And we have an inward sense, the mind. And because we have these senses, what gets set up is a chain of events that start off automatically, but then we fuel according to our relationship to what is going on. And it's in the fueling that we need to look at what's happening. So if we have a functioning eye and we have something to look at, for instance, this book that I'm reading from, a functioning eye and the book, they come together, they create eye consciousness. And when we have eye consciousness, a functioning eye and the object that we're looking at, we get contact in the brain. Contact is, if you like, the awareness of that consciousness. Okay, so as a consequence, that contact is an event in the brain, which is automatic as a consequence of the book, the functioning eye, and the arising of eye consciousness. With contact comes feeling, and feeling is pleasant or unpleasant, or neither pleasant or unpleasant. And up to that point, it's an automatic process. It doesn't matter if we're an arahant, or we're just starting off in the meditation, or if we've done no meditation at all. This process is a consequence of having a physical body. But the next moment is the interesting one. The next moment is when we react or respond to that feeling of pleasantness or unpleasantness, or neither pleasant or unpleasant. When we react to that feeling, that's when we express a preference. And that preference is, I like it, I don't like it, I want it, I don't want it. And when that mind comes up, and this is the wonderful insight, if you like, in the way that Bhante Vimoransi teaches his meditation, there's an associated tension and tightness around our physical brain and potentially in our body as well. So as soon as we express that preference, we start a chain of events, which is this I like it, I don't like it mind. And with the I like it, I don't like it mind, then follows the story. And the story is basically, I don't like this because. And so the story then begins to fuel, because it brings out of our past experience the investment we've made around this feeling that we're having. And that's based on past experience, on our beliefs, on our habitual ways of thinking and reacting. All of these contribute together to create a preference. And a preference is quite simply an opinion about how the present moment should be. And one of the things about loving kindness is that it's not about a personal preference. This isn't a personal love. The loving kindness is a universal love. Loving kindness is, if you like, a loving acceptance of the present moment, however it is, without measurement or judgment. So if we don't have that response to the present moment, we move into having a preference. And that's what the Buddha is describing here. With the preference comes the story, And with the story comes our habitual patterns of thinking, speaking, acting, based on those stories. So, the tears and anguish that follow arguments and quarrels, said the Buddha, the arrogance and pride, the grudges and insults that go with them, are all the result of one thing. They come from having preferences, from holding things precious and dear. Insults are born of arguments, and grudges are inseparable from quarrels. But why, sir, do we have these preferences, these special things? Why do we have so much greed? And all the aspirations and achievements that we base our lives on, where do we get them from? So here we have, where is this greed? And remember, greed is a double-sided thing. Greed is, wanting to hold on to something. But the flip side of greed is not wanting something, the aversion. So here's the greed and the aversion. Why are we always in this pull and push in our experience? And all the aspirations and achievements. Well, this is about, an aspiration is something we project into the future. It's something that we aspire to. So here's future coming in. And our achievements, if you like, are our collections of past things that have happened, which we have achieved. This is the past. And one of the things about preference, or not having a preference, is about your relationship to the present time. Can we have a relationship to the present time which is not referencing past achievements or future aspirations? Now, this doesn't mean that we don't have plans. We can make a plan for something. But if we live in the plan, we're living in that aspiration. And that's not what the Buddha is asking us to do. So we can have a plan to sit down and meditate each morning. That's absolutely fine. That's a constructive and useful thing to do. But if we then beat ourselves up because one morning we don't do that, then we've lived in the aspiration of, I'm going to practice every single day. And we've identified with that aspiration, and then we've fallen short. The preferences, the precious things, said the Buddha, come from the impulse of desire. So too does the greed. And so too do the aspirations and achievements that make up people's lives. So the things that we hold dear, the precious things, they are, if you like, fed and maintained by this impulse of desire, the wanting mind, or the not wanting mind. And the Buddha says here that, this type of mind is not helpful. It's part of the fuel that creates disputes and contention. And remember, disputes and contention aren't always about our relationships with other people. A lot of the time we can be, contentious and disputing with ourselves. So the Buddha's asking us here to have a different relationship to something which is, if you like, very familiar. From where, sir, comes this impulse for desire? From where do we derive our theories and opinions? So these are our personal beliefs, our habitual ways of thinking, speaking, acting. And what about all the other things that you, the wanderer, have named, such as anger, dishonesty, and confusion? So we're all familiar with anger on occasions, when things are not the way we would wish them to be, and we want them different to how they are, and we have an uncomfortable feeling, and we want to get rid of this uncomfortable feeling, and we project outwardly that the source of this uncomfortable feeling is not within us, but the result of something external. And as Sister Kima would say, it's not things that are done to us, they come from us. So when we take responsibility for our response to the way things are, how we feel, then we're taking responsibility for what comes from us. And the dishonesty, well, what's the dishonesty here? Well, we can think of dishonesty as in general terms, but also that when we're not seeing clearly, we're not seeing honestly what's going on inside us. So when we start to confuse things by our opinions and our beliefs, rather than what we directly observe and understand from observation and clear-sightedness, then this is just going to add to the third of these things, which is confusion. The impulse of desire arises when people think of one thing as pleasant and another as unpleasant. That is the source of desire. So in daily life, we can recognize this so clearly. We would prefer to move towards the pleasant and away from the unpleasant. But what's interesting is that the pleasant and unpleasant are not always, or even mostly, a characteristic of the circumstance itself. So we can be familiar of doing one thing on one occasion, and it has a pleasant feeling and we're pleased with it and that, and on another occasion it might not be. Or we can move from the pleasant to the unpleasant. So when we eat very dark chocolate, for instance, a couple of pieces, very nice. If we then go on to eat the whole bar, sooner or later, we're more than likely to feel that this is enough, and now the experience is spoiled. Yeah? And so what was once pleasant has then moved to the unpleasant, but the chocolate has remained the same. And so what we deem pleasant and unpleasant isn't always an attribute of the thing itself, but our relationship to it. So there's the source of desire. With the chocolate, first of all, we're holding on, we want more, and then we get to the point where we don't want more. The impulse of desire arises when people think of one thing as pleasant and another as unpleasant. That is the source of desire. It is when people see that material things are subject both to becoming and to disintegration that they form their theories about the world. So our opinions come when we begin to see that things are not permanent, not unchanging, not inalterable. But we begin to see that they're subject to arising and they're subject to disintegration. So anger, confusion, and dishonesty arise when things are set as in pairs as opposites. So in order to sustain anger, we need to create a them and an us. So this setting things as pairs and as opposites is necessary to sustain this. And so when we develop an independent identity around things, that's separating us out from the whole of the experience. And so one of the things that creates quarrels and disputes is this sense of personal identity. If we allow ourselves to see ourselves as part of a greater whole, and this is where the loving kindness becomes much more universal rather than just to ourselves, but begins to move outward to all others. This is encouraging us to begin to connect to the whole, if you like, rather than the individual. And then we begin to move into compassion with the practice. And the compassion starts to come when we begin to recognize that the things that we struggle with and the things that we develop are also the same in other people, the same struggles, the same developments, that this is part of the common human condition. And when we begin to see this more as a whole, with more sense of loving kindness and compassion, it's much harder then to separate out into pairs and opposites that's necessary to sustain the sense of anger and the confusion and the dishonesty. And the dishonesty here is not seeing clearly the wider whole. So anger, confusion, and dishonesty arise when things are set in pairs as opposites. A person with perplexity must train himself in the path of knowledge. So here the Buddha is describing that the way out of perplexity is to train the mind. The recluse, the Buddha, has declared the truth after personal realization. So here's the invitation to personally understand, to practice and develop the awareness. But why, sir, is it that we find some things pleasant and some unpleasant? What could we do to stop that? And this idea of becoming and disintegration, could you explain where that comes from? It is the action of contact, of mental impression, that leads to the feeling of pleasant and unpleasant. So this contact that comes from the eye, the book, eye consciousness arising, the three of those things coming together is this contact. And that is the seed coming through. So what does this contact come from? And the grasping habit, what's the reason for that? Is there anything that can be done to get rid of possessiveness and anything that could be eliminated so that there would be no more contact? Contact exists because the compound of mind and matter exists. Mind and matter is like our physical body and our mind. It's mentality and materiality. The habit of grasping is based on wanting things. So here's the I want it, I don't want it mind. This reaction to feeling. If there were no wanting, there would be no possessiveness. Similarly, without the element of form, matter, body, rupa, there would be no contact. What pursuit leads a person to get rid of form? And how can suffering and pleasure cease to exist? This is what I want to know about. There is a state where form ceases to exist, said the Buddha. It is a state without ordinary perception and without disordered perception, and without no perception, and without any annihilation of perception. It is perception, consciousness, that is the source of all the basic obstacles. So here's a wonderful description of Nibbana. Nibbana is a state without ordinary perception. It's a state without disordered perception. So disordered perception would be a perception that's colored and influenced by our lack of seeing clearly. It is without no perception and without any annihilation of perception. So the state of Nibbana is very different to the state that we are familiar with in daily life. Because it's perception, and perception here is the naming of things, the memory of things. So as we experience looking at a book, we see shape, that's form, we see color, and then the brain recognizes that as a book. And in the naming of it a book, perception comes. So it's not possible without consciousness and perception. They work together. And so as we get contact, we get feeling, and feeling, perception, and consciousness come together at the same time. So in the recognizing of the book, we also have pleasant or unpleasant response within our physical brain, within the mind. It is perception and consciousness that is the source of all basic obstacles. So you have explained to us everything we have asked you about. There is one question we would like you to answer for us. Do the learned scholars of the world say that this is the highest purification of the individual being, or do they say there is some other kind of goal? There are scholars and authorities, replied the Buddha, who say that this is the highest and the purification of the individual. There are others who maintain that the highest purification is to be found in the complete eradication of the 5 components of the person. So this would be a theory which said that we needed to get rid of, annihilate the body and the mind. Rupa, the body, and the mind described as feeling, perception, sankharas, or our volitional formations, the things that come up in the mind from an act of will, and that might be anything from loving kindness and compassion to anger or frustration, our intention. All of these things are part of the sankharas. In fact, they're all of our mental activity, which is not feeling or consciousness, and perception and consciousness. So what we have here is the suggestion that we need to annihilate all of these things. But that's not what the Buddha was saying, because he said liberation was available, in this life. So the Buddha then goes on to I'm sorry about that interruption. We had a power problem here. So coming back, there are scholars and authorities, replied the Buddha, who say that this is the highest and the purification of the individual. And there are others who maintain that the highest purity is to be found in the complete eradication of the 5 components of the body. That's the canvas we're describing. And there is also the Muni. So this is, if you like, the person who is developing through the style of meditation that the Buddha described. He has realized which things are dependencies, and he knows that these are only crutches and props. So, dependencies. This is a description of dependent origination. And with dependent origination, classically, what the Buddha describes is basically because of this arises, that comes to be. When this ceases, that ceases. So here's the dependency. This needs to be present for this to arise. When this is no longer present, this ceases. So when we look here and see that these dependencies are just crutches and props for experience, when he has realized this, he has become free. So it's in the seeing of this dependency, it's in the seeing of this middle section of dependent origination, which is so present in everything we do in daily life. We have an experience from one of the senses. Something we see, something we smell, perhaps we taste, a touch of the body, something we hear, or a thought that comes up, or an image in the mind. And because of that, we have a feeling about it. Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. They have come up, the feelings have come up, dependent upon the experience of our senses. And with that feeling comes craving. Craving is dependent upon feeling. And then comes the story about why we like it or don't like it. This is the clinging. And that is dependent upon the clinging being there. And then we have our habitual responses. And that is dependent upon the story that we're telling ourselves. So here are all the dependencies. Here are the props and the supports that make up our experience. And so he has realized which things are dependencies, and he knows that these are only crutches and props. And when he has realized this, he has become free. So this process of recognizing this brings dispassion into our practice. And dispassion is, before dispassion comes disenchantment. And disenchantment is the losing of the stickiness of this experience. So when something arises, we get drawn towards something or we get repelled away from it. This is the stickiness of experience. And when we begin to remove that stickiness, then we're no longer enchanted with what arises from the senses. So whatever it is, it's not that we don't enjoy it, but we don't get stuck in the enjoyment. We don't need the enjoyment to persist. We don't get sad if whatever we're experiencing then finishes. We don't hold on. And equally, if something occurs that we don't like, that is unpleasant, we don't try our hardest to push that away. Because in the pushing away, in the aversion, we then begin to identify with the fear of, well, what happens if this doesn't go away? What if this isn't impermanent? And we have this tendency to feel in our daily life that the unpleasant things are long persisting, and the pleasant things are often felt as short intervals, interrupting this long persisting of things that are challenging. Whereas actually the Buddha said this is not so. Things are dependently arisen. When the conditions are right, something arises. When the conditions change, that changes. And when we see this for ourselves, not just intellectually understand it, but see it as an experience, then the enchantment that we had, the stickiness and our response to this drops away. And it's a slow process of understanding and observation and seeing it multiple times. It allows this disenchantment to come in. And when the disenchanted mind is present, then dispassion can arise. And dispassion means that we're not emotionally charged around the experience because we're not owning it personally. And so the dispassion means that we can remain balanced around whatever the experience is. It doesn't mean that we don't understand what's important and we don't understand what's right and wrong. Of course, these are all present. We don't recognize that things are, well, we do recognize when things are inappropriate, when things are supportive and good for the practice and all of these things. But we don't have this emotional charge, which is when the emotions are informing our relationship to experience. So that's the dispassion. He has realized which things are dependencies, and he knows that these things are only crutches and props. And when he has realized this, he has become free. He does not enter into arguments, and so does not enter the round of endless becomings. So when we enter arguments, we take up a position. This is when we set ourselves up as pairs and opposites. And then when we do that, we've immediately brought ourselves into that chain of, I want it, I like it, I don't like it, I don't want it, the story, our habitual patterns of thinking and behaving around that. And that's what then generates the endless round of becoming, because that then regenerates, the karmic consequence through our action, our birth of action from that. And that feeds us back into our sensory experience. Might be a thought in the mind, might be a feeling in the body, which then informs the next moment. And here's this continual chain of events going round and round and round. And this is the round of endless becoming in the present time experience and in the widest context of around rebirth as well. Because if we're caught in these patterns, they will inform the conditions at the end of life, which generate the conditions at the start of the next life. So disputes and contentions are really, really valuable and helpful for us because they show us where our attachment and aversion is. And that's what we need to learn. And so, as Bhante Vimramsi will say, our hindrances, and they are our attachment, our aversions, our restlessness, our anger, our grief, our skeptical doubt around the practice, the sense of sloth and torpor, that tiredness and torpidity of mind. All of these are hindrances which fuel into the next moment. And just like Bhante Vimramsi will say, the hindrances are our teachers. So in our daily life and in our relationship to ourselves, our contentions and disputes are also our teachers because they inform us about where our attachment and inversions are. And that's what we need to work with. So, apologies for the brief interruption halfway through there. And I'd like to ask you just to reflect on that for a minute, we're going to do a very short practice. So sit comfortably. Relax in your hips, relax in your shoulders, and let your spine come into balance. Let your head float on top of your spine. Don't be in dispute with your own body. Allow it to come into balance. Gently smile and relax any holding and bracing around your physical brain. And softly smile. If you're working with the 6 directions, work with your practice in that way. If you're working with a spiritual friend, then just bring up a time when you felt joyful and happy. And say to yourself, may I be well, may I be happy. And let that feeling of happiness be present in you. And then let the memory drop. And then you might invite also your heart to be open and accepting. And a heart that's open and accepting is not a heart that is disputing or contentious. And whenever our mind gets distracted, this is when we've taken an experience and expressed a preference, not allowing the experience simply to be there and fade away on its own, but to hold on to it for whatever reason and develop it into a thought, an image, a reaction. And so the 6 R's are all about bringing the mind back to a state of no preference. bring your attention to the sense of contact with the ground. Then you take a deliberate breath in and out. And then softly and slowly open your eyes. Okay. So, any questions that you have? Perhaps I can just ask people individually. Or do you recognize the nature of preferences in the mind and the impact it has?
Yes, I think I do, but I'm not sure I deal with them in the best possible way. You mentioned towards the end that the hindrances show us where our attachments are.
Yes.
Bhante Vimalaramsi always used to say that there's nothing in the hindrances, there's nothing to learn there, and I think we should ignore them. So how do we get to learn where our attachments are? And when we learn where they are, what do we do about it? Because we're just supposed to be watching, aren't we?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that Bhante Vimalaramsi would say is the hindrances are our teacher, because when they arise, they show us that we've been caught by attachment or aversion. So it's in their arising that they teach us, not in actually wallowing in the content of them.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's the process that we're interested in. And this is why the 6 R's are so important, because the 6 R's embrace the 4 Noble Truths, they embrace the Eightfold Path, they embrace the factors of awakening. All of those things are in the process of the 6 R's. And so when we notice mind's movement, which is Bhante's description of mindfulness, is the awareness of movements of mind. When we notice mind has moved from our object of meditation, and it will move because of a hindrance, that's what we notice, because then we use the 6 R's to bring ourselves back. So the hindrance is helpful because it shows us the presence of attachment or aversion. So we're interested in the how. How does mind move? And that reveals the structure of dependent origination, but not the why. So it's the context of mind's movement, not the content of mind's movement. So I think when Bhante was saying that, and I don't wish to speak for him, but my understanding of what he was saying is that the content doesn't have information that's useful for us, but the context does. Does that help?
Yeah. So if the attachment is, say, anger, we don't try to do anything with the anger. We just 6 R.
Yeah, we notice the anger has arisen. Yeah. And then we recognize that that's happened, that we've taken something personally, might be an image or a memory, or it might be a feeling in the body. We might sit down and within 5 minutes, our body's beginning to ache in a particular place, and we can be angry that how am I going to sit for an hour if it's, we've taken the sensation personally. And the consequence of taking the sensation personally is that the hindrance has now taken over, and we've moved away from the object of our attention. So then the 6 R is what helps come back. And the 6 R has 2 components to it. First is the purification of the mind. So the first step of that is to recognize our mind isn't on the object of attention. That means we're no longer lost in what distracted us, but we've seen the distraction has happened. Then we redirect our mind away from what has caught our attention, back towards the object of attention. And in that process, we release the tension we feel around the brain and anywhere else in the body that it occurs. We softly smile. And in the smiling, we start the second half of the second part of the 6 R's, which is the retraining of the mind. We're moving from the unwholesome, that's purifying the mind, and then we're generating the wholesome, which is the smile, and then coming back to the feeling of loving kindness. These are wholesome states. And so we've replaced the unwholesome with the wholesome in that process. So the hindrances are very helpful because they reveal our attachments and aversions, but we're not interested in exploring the why behind the anger. Simply the context in which the anger had arisen. Is that helpful?
Yes, that explains well. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. And Lilita, I think you just put in a question. What is the best thing to do when we realize we are in dispute with another individual? How should we react ideally? Well, I think this is a question we all explore perhaps on a regular basis. But the thing that happens is, and what is described in the sutta here, is that dispute only occurs when we set ourselves up as in pairs, as opposites. So when there's that sense of separation between the two parties, that's when the dispute is fueled. So one of the things that we could possibly work with here is to understand where the other person is coming from, to reduce the distance between the two. We may not agree with their position, but if they believe that they've been heard and seen and listened to, a lot of the energy of dispute begins to leach away. And an important part of that is recognizing the resistance we have to move from where we are to recognize where they are. It doesn't mean that we don't still feel that where we are is a preferred outcome, if you like, in terms. But when we begin to listen, and it's in the depth of the listening, we begin to dissolve the boundaries between us. And that, I think, is always an important first step. If we only adopt a defensive position when we see a dispute coming up, we're reinforcing the separation. And it's okay for us to say we don't understand. Remember the forgiveness meditation that Bhante Vimarahamsi talks about and uses and finds very helpful. And one of the phrases he uses is, I forgive myself for not understanding at that time. It's okay in a dispute to say, I don't understand your position here. Please explain it more. I would like to understand, your perspective in this. And then the thing is, of course, is to listen. It's no good if that person then says something and we immediately contradict it. But that's not what I said, or that's not what the situation is. No, we need to hold a space. And this is where the meditation training is so useful. Just like you hold a space when the body's uncomfortable, or when the mind is moving around and we 6R and we come back, and we 6R and we come back, and we 6R and come back. So when we're doing this deep listening to someone, we need to step back from that impetus to engage and correct and put a different perspective. Listening opens people up. When we correct, it closes them down and they begin to adopt a defensive position. Alita, is that something which you recognize, and is that a helpful perspective?
Yes, of course. This was helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions I'd like to add as a consequence of this? No? Okay, so then we need to move into just the closing right? And for those of you who might not be able to remember it completely, I'm just going to share a screen. Here we are. So hopefully you can see that.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so sharing merit. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much for joining us today.